The wind howled through the mountain pass like a wild beast, slamming into Ella's truck with every turn. Her wipers fought in vain against the swirling snow that danced like angry ghosts across her windshield. Visibility was barely a few feet, but she kept driving, slow, steady, knuckles white against the wheel. Each gust outside seemed to echo the turmoil within her chest. Her heartbeat thudded in her ears, not just from the storm, but from the heavy silence inside the cab. She hadn't spoken a word since clocking out. There was no one to call. No one waiting at home. All she wanted was to get through the night. But as the storm raged, something about the fury in the air felt personal, like the world wasn't just punishing the landscape, but punishing her too. Her hands trembled as she adjusted the defroster. The scent of antiseptic still clung to her coat, the ghost of the hospital lingering in her nose. She had done everything she could, compression after compression. But the little boy hadn't made it. The mother's scream still rang in her mind. She told herself not to cry, not in front of the other nurses. But now, in the storm, her eyes burned. Her shoulders ached from tension and from holding it all in. Another life gone, another family shattered. And still, the world just kept spinning, snow falling like it didn't care who hurt beneath it. The thought of her cabin didn't bring comfort. It used to be warm, filled with laughter, guitar strings, the clinking of mugs her brother insisted were real coffee cups. Now, it was a tomb of echoes. His boots still sat by the door. His flannel still hung by the firewood rack. She couldn't bear to move them. The silence inside was different from the silence outside. One was wild, the other, final. She was returning to an emptiness that knew her name, wore her memories, and waited each night to bury her a little deeper in it. There were no more tears, just a weight. It settled on her shoulders like wet wool and never dried. She functioned, sure, ate when her body forced her, spoke when someone demanded words, but the world passed in gray tones now. Grief had made her numb to beauty and blind to laughter. It didn't rage, it lingered. And tonight, wrapped in that numbness, she drove on autopilot, not for hope of comfort, but simply because she didn't know what else to do. She didn't mean to take the river road, but her hands turned the wheel there anyway. The stretch was quiet, untouched. Trees bowed under ice. The river ran black beneath the bridge, its surface frosting over. She used to love this drive. She and her brother would race snowflakes here, pretending to outpace winter itself. Now, she just drove slowly, as if the falling snow could bury the memories she couldn't outrun. Her headlights swept over the edge of the bridge and froze. A shadow darted across the embankment, large, fast. At first, she thought it was a deer, but no, it moved with a purpose, toward the ledge. And then, in a split second, it leapt. A massive shape hurled itself over the edge and disappeared into the black, icy water below. The sound, a heavy splash, shattered her daze. Ella slammed the brake. Tires skidded on ice. Her heart jackhammered in her chest as she flung open the door and stumbled into the snow. "Hey, hey!" she screamed into the wind. Nothing. Snowflakes sliced her cheeks as she squinted into the darkness below the bridge. The river churned, angry and cold. And then, just barely, she saw something thrashing in the current. Not something, someone, or something else. The tires screamed against the icy asphalt as Ella slammed her foot on the brake. Her car skidded sideways, heart leaping into her throat. Through the windshield, snow whipped in sheets, blurring the world into gray and white chaos. Then, movement. A shadow darting across the frozen road, heading toward the riverbank. Without thinking, she threw the car into park, yanked open the door, and bolted into the storm. The wind hit her like a wall, numbing her face instantly, but her focus locked on the silhouette, just in time to see it leap over the embankment. Her instincts roared to life. Someone was in danger. Someone had jumped. Her boots crunched and slipped on the frost as she sprinted, unsure of what waited for her beyond the edge. As she reached the riverbank, Ella froze. The churning water below held no human form, no flailing limbs, no cries for help. Instead, she saw fur, soaked, slick, and golden brown, thrashing through the icy current. A dog, a German shepherd. Muscles taut, the animal swam upstream, its snout barely above the freezing water, its eyes locked on something ahead. Ella's breath caught. The storm howled around her, the snow thickening, but she couldn't take her eyes off the scene unfolding before her. The dog wasn't just surviving the current, it was fighting it, with a kind of wild purpose. Ella stumbled closer, her heart pounding now not just with urgency but awe. Then another shape. Farther out, almost invisible in the blizzard's wrath. Ella parpadeó, haciendo parpadear copos de nieve desde sus pestañas. A flicker of color, blue, red, softened by distance and frost. Then it moved. Her breath hitched. A child. A tiny body clung to a piece of ice, drifting away from the shore. The toddler's arms were locked around the slab, his head bobbing low. His face was pale, his lips purple. The dog paddled fiercely toward him, barking hoarsely between strokes. He wasn't just in the river by accident. He was chasing the child, guiding, guarding. Ella's limbs went rigid with horror and helplessness. That boy was seconds from going under. Something primal surged within her, a command that drowned out reason and fear. She kicked off her boots, tore off her jacket, and stepped toward the icy water. The dog reached the boy and barked again, as if begging Ella to move. Ella dove. The cold hit her like fire, a violent jolt that seized her chest and stole the breath from her lungs. For a split second, her body rebelled, panic flooding her veins. But she forced her limbs forward, pushing through the current, eyes locked on the child. The shepherd swam beside her now, the two of them navigating the ice-choked water as one desperate unit. Her arms burned. Her fingers went numb. But still, she fought. Teeth gritted against the pain, the wind howling like a chorus of ghosts overhead. Every second counted. Every stroke mattered. The child floated only feet away now. But he was slipping under. Her hand found fabric. A soaked little jacket barely clinging to warm life. Ella latched on, wrapping one arm around the boy's limp torso and kicking furiously toward the shore. The shepherd circled them, barking, nudging, guiding. Her teeth chattered, her muscles screamed, but somehow, through the storm and the cold and the chaos, they made it. Her knees scraped the riverbed. She dragged herself up the embankment, cradling the child against her chest, sobs mingling with frozen breath. The boy coughed, weakly but alive. And the dog? He stood a few feet away, soaked and trembling, but still watching. Ella envolvió al niño en su chaqueta, presionando su pequeño cuerpo cerca del suyo mientras lo mecía suavemente. He whimpered, the sound barely audible over the storm, but it was a sound. He was breathing. Across from her, the German shepherd stood still. He didn't bark, didn't pace, just watched, with an intensity that spoke of understanding. His fur clung to his sides, soaked and heavy, steam rising from his body. He shivered, violently at times, but didn't take a step forward. He waited, not for thanks, not for warmth, but for something else, something deeper. The paramedics arrived moments later, flashing lights slicing through the storm's gloom. Hands lifted the child from her arms. Warm blankets replaced her soaked coat. Someone guided her to a stretcher, speaking soft reassurances she barely heard. Her gaze never left the dog. He stood at a distance, eyes locked onto hers. No tag, no collar, nothing to name him or claim him, and yet he looked at her like he knew her. Not just in the moment, but before it. A connection neither time nor reason could explain. As the commotion swelled, people gathered, neighbors, first responders, curious strangers. Whispers passed between them. Where did the dog come from? Was he with the boy? Whose is he? But no one stepped forward. No one knew his name. No one came to collect him. Still, he stayed. Quiet. Still. Watching Ella as if waiting for a sign. She wiped a tear from her cheek, then reached a trembling hand toward him. He didn't move, but something in his stance shifted. A silent acknowledgement. This wasn't over. Whatever had begun in that river, it wasn't finished. As the ambulance pulled away with the child, sirens fading into the storm, Ella stood alone. The dog stepped closer now, still silent, his eyes never leaving hers. He was soaked, exhausted, but steadfast. She knelt beside him, placing a hand gently on his neck. His fur was ice cold, but his eyes held warmth. In that moment, something passed between them, not words, not logic, but trust, a thread invisible but strong. Ella no sabía de dónde venía él, or why he'd been there, but she knew this: she couldn't walk away, not from him, not anymore. Ella stood at the doorway, hesitating. The weather outside was unforgiving, a cold, harsh wind that cut through every crack of her old house. Shadow, the large dog she had found trembling in the snow just hours before, looked up at her with those soulful eyes that seemed to say more than words ever could. She'd promised herself it would be temporary, just a stopover, a place to warm up for the night. But as Shadow curled up on the rug in front of the fireplace, she couldn't help but feel an unexpected tug at her heart. The way he lay there, as though he had always belonged, felt like an unspoken invitation. She shook her head, trying to remind herself that tomorrow she would find him a proper home. Just one night, she whispered, a promise that would slowly unravel with each passing hour. The next morning, Ella watched as Shadow moved through the house with ease. He didn't wander aimlessly, as she might have expected from a stray, nor did he show signs of aggression. Instead, he exhibited a quiet confidence that surprised her. He seemed to know where things were, where to sit, and even how to behave. When Ella prepared breakfast, Shadow patiently waited by the door, watching her, never begging for scraps. There was something oddly familiar about him, as though he had been raised in a home much like hers. The way he sat by the door made Ella think of a dog trained to wait for permission, to follow commands, and to remain calm in the presence of food. She couldn't help but wonder, who had he belonged to before? Why had he ended up alone? As the days stretched on, Ella found herself speaking to Shadow, more out of habit than anything else. She wasn't sure why, but it felt comforting to share her thoughts with him. She'd never been one to open up easily, especially after the loss of her brother. He had been her only family, the one person she could count on, and now there was an empty space in her life where his laughter used to be. At night, when the house was quiet and the silence threatened to swallow her whole, she would sit on the couch with Shadow by her feet and talk to him about things she hadn't told anyone. She told him about her brother's dreams, about the things they had shared, about the grief that gripped her heart. Shadow listened, his eyes soft, his presence steady. He didn't judge. He didn't interrupt. He simply sat with her, as if offering her the solace she desperately needed. One evening, as Ella recounted a story about her brother, his mischievous grin, his infectious laugh, something in her chest tightened. A single tear escaped her eye, and then another, until her face was wet with the weight of memories. She reached for her phone, her hands trembling, scrolling through the old messages between them. The last one, his last text before everything had changed, echoed in her mind. "Love you, sis. See you soon." The words, so simple, yet now so haunting. She buried her face in her hands, overwhelmed by the grief that had been building for so long. Shadow, who had been sitting at her feet, moved closer and nudged his head gently into her lap. He didn't move away when she cried. Instead, he stayed there, his body warm and solid against her legs, offering comfort in the only way he knew how. His presence was enough, and that was all she needed. It was during one of those long nights, the kind where the weight of grief became too heavy to carry, that Ella found herself struggling to breathe. Her chest tightened, and a wave of panic washed over her, the familiar feeling of anxiety closing in. Her mind raced, her breath shallow and rapid, as she tried to calm herself. Shadow, who had been lying quietly on the floor, suddenly stood up. His eyes never left her, and before she could process what was happening, he placed his large paw gently on her trembling leg. The simple touch, so grounding and reassuring, sent a wave of calm through her. Shadow didn't move, didn't make a sound. He just stayed there, his paw resting on her, as though telling her that everything would be okay. At that moment, Ella realized that this dog, this stranger who had come into her life, was more than just an animal. He was her anchor. The panic attack subsided, but the weight of everything Ella had been holding back surged to the surface. She didn't try to stop it. She let the sobs come, let the gasps for air break through her lips. There was no longer any use in pretending she was okay. She had buried her grief for so long, and now it was flooding out in waves, rage, sorrow, fear, all mixed together in a chaotic storm. Shadow stayed with her through it all, his body pressed against her, his eyes never leaving her face. He didn't flinch at her tears, didn't pull away when she cried out in pain. He simply remained by her side, a steady presence, grounding her in the chaos. For the first time in months, Ella felt like someone understood her, without needing words. Shadow was there, and that was all she needed. But not every night was peaceful. Shadow's sleep was restless at times, his body tense, his ears perked, his eyes darting to unseen corners of the room. Sometimes, in the dead of night, Ella would wake to find him jerking awake, a low growl rumbling deep in his throat. His fur would bristle, his body tense, as though he was lost in a nightmare of his own. Ella no lo entendió, pero podía sentir la inquietud en él. It was as if he was reliving something painful, something that haunted him even in his sleep. She would reach out, gently placing a hand on his head, and he would calm, eventually settling back down. But there were moments when she wondered, what had he been through before he came to her? What kind of past did this gentle dog carry with him? As the weeks passed, Ella began to notice something else about Shadow. He was always alert, especially around strangers. It wasn't aggression, but more of a low, protective growl that emanated from him when someone came too close. He wasn't unfriendly, but his instincts were sharp. Ella couldn't help but notice how he would stiffen, his body rigid, watching the strangers with a calculating gaze. He seemed to be sizing them up, assessing whether they posed a threat. It made Ella wonder even more about his past. What had happened to him before? What had he experienced that made him so cautious, so protective? The mystery of his life before he found her lingered in the back of her mind. But one thing was certain. He was fiercely loyal, and he would protect her without hesitation. One afternoon, while Ella was outside with Shadow, a neighbor approached her, her voice lowered to a whisper. "I heard about the dog you found," she said, her gaze darting around as if she feared someone might overhear. There was a fire not far from here a while back. A man, a cruel man. He used to train dogs for fights. They say some of those dogs never make it out of the fire. You should be careful with him. The words hit Ella like a punch to the gut. Her stomach churned and her heart sank. She had known there was something about Shadow's past that didn't sit right, but to hear these rumors, to consider the possibility that he had been part of something so dark, it made her question everything. Could the gentle dog who had saved a child, who had saved her, really be tied to violence? Despite the rumors, despite the whispers of violence and cruelty, Ella refused to believe it. Shadow had saved a child. He had shown her nothing but loyalty, comfort, and love. She couldn't reconcile the image of this dog who had become her companion with the possibility of the darkness in his past. The thought made her heart ache, but her bond with Shadow had already grown too strong. She refused to let the past define him, just as she was trying to heal from the past that haunted her own heart. No matter what his history held, she knew one thing for certain: Shadow was no threat to her. He had been her protector, her confidant, and her friend, and that, to Ella, was all that mattered. Ella's breath catches in her throat as her fingers brush through Shadow's thick, dark fur. She had been grooming him for hours, a simple, soothing routine they'd both come to enjoy over the years. But today, something feels different. As her hands glide over his neck, she feels something hard, something unnatural. A small, smooth object lodged beneath his fur. Her heart races and she hesitates, confusion clouding her mind. What could this be? She parts the fur more carefully, her pulse quickening as she uncovers a small metallic object, something that feels like a microchip. A sinking feeling settles in her stomach. Shadow, her faithful companion, had been through so much. But this was a betrayal of trust she hadn't prepared for. How long had this been there? Why hadn't she noticed it before? Her eyes widened in disbelief, the air in the room suddenly heavy. The tension in Ella's chest intensifies as she connects the chip to her computer, her fingers trembling. The screen flashes to life, the information uploading quickly, and then nothing. A cold, robotic notification appears on the screen. Database error, chip linked to criminal case. Ella leans in closer, reading the details. Her stomach drops as the name of the shelter flashes on the screen. A place she knew to be shady. A place that wasn't known for taking in strays, but for selling them to the highest bidder. The realization hits her like a punch in the gut. Shadow, her Shadow, had been part of something she couldn't have imagined. He wasn't just an abandoned dog. He was an escapee from a criminal network. Her mind races as a wave of anger and fear overwhelms her. She'd had no idea. The knock on the door is firm, unyielding. Ella jumps, dropping the mouse in her hand. She hurries to answer, her stomach a knot of dread. When she opens the door, the uniformed officers stand there, their faces stern. One of them hands her a thick stack of papers, his expression cold. "You're Ella Harding?" one officer asks, eyes scanning her face for any sign of recognition. "We're here to take the dog." Ella's heart skips a beat. "What do you mean, take him?" She struggles to find her voice. Shadow hasn't done anything wrong. The microchip traces back to a criminal investigation across state lines, the officer says, his tone detached, almost rehearsed. "We're here to evaluate him, for his safety and yours." Ella's voice cracks as she pleads with the officers, desperation rising in her chest. "He's not dangerous," she says, her eyes searching their faces, willing them to understand. "Shadow saved a child's life. He's the most loyal dog you'll ever meet. He's my family." The officers exchange a look, their faces hard, but there's something else there too, a flicker of doubt. Ella takes a step forward, her breath shaky but determined. Please, please don't take him. But the officer steps back, shaking his head. We have no choice, ma'am. The law is the law. The days after the officers left are a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and sleepless nights. Ella knows she has to act fast. She won't let Shadow be treated like a criminal. The dog who'd pulled her out of a burning house, the dog who had stayed by her side through thick and thin, deserved better. She takes to the streets, knocking on doors, speaking with neighbors who'd witnessed the rescue. One by one, they agree to help. It's not just about Shadow anymore, it's about standing up for what's right. Ella rallies the community, starting a petition, and soon, neighbors who once stood back now rise to defend the dog they all know and love. The support pours in, signatures from the local community flooding in, showing the authorities just how loved and needed Shadow really is. Despite the growing support, the authorities remain firm. Ella receives letter after letter, each one heavier than the last. Threats of legal action if she doesn't comply. Shadow's fate hangs in the balance. The cold weight of the reality sets in. If they can't prove Shadow's innocence, he could be euthanized. Ella feels the walls closing in, each official letter another blow, but she won't give up, not now. That night, Ella is asleep when the fire starts. Thick smoke fills the hallway, choking the air as flames lick at the walls. Ella's lungs burn as she tries to move, but the smoke is too dense, the heat too overwhelming. She coughs violently, her head spinning, her vision blurring. Then, through the smoke, she hears it, Shadow's bark. It's frantic, urgent. He's at her side, pulling at her with a surprising strength. His paws dig into the ground, and he drags her toward the door, never stopping to look back. Each tug is a life-saving pull, and Ella can barely stay conscious, but she knows that Shadow will not stop until she's safe. His loyalty is unwavering. The heat presses in, but somehow, with Shadow's help, she makes it outside, gasping for air. Word spreads fast. News outlets, local and national, pick up the story. Shadow, the dog once thought to be a criminal, is now a hero. His courageous rescue makes headlines, and the public watches in awe as the dog who once had a murky past saves his owner once again. Ella is interviewed, her face a mixture of exhaustion and gratitude. The world finally sees Shadow for who he really is. A loyal companion, a brave soul. The fight to keep him had been hard, but it was worth every moment. The story doesn't end with the fire. As the media attention grows, the pressure on the authorities mounts. They can't ignore the truth anymore. People everywhere are rallying behind Shadow, sharing his story, demanding that he be allowed to stay with Ella. And so, the authorities reconsider. In a moment of rare clarity, they announce that Shadow's status will be reevaluated. The media storm has forced their hand, and the public's support is undeniable. Shadow has gone from fugitive to hero in the eyes of the world. As Ella watches Shadow curl up beside her, his head resting on her lap, she can't help but wonder. Shadow had come from a past filled with pain and betrayal, but it didn't define him. His future, their future, was built on love, loyalty, and the bond they shared. Ella's eyes meet Shadow's, and she smiles through her tears. "We've made it, buddy," she whispers. "You and me." In that moment, she knows the truth. Where we come from doesn't matter as much as the love we choose to give and receive. And in this love, there is redemption. There is peace. Ella's heart skipped as she stared at the phone in her trembling hands. The words she'd been waiting for, praying for, finally rang through the line. "Shadow has completed his rehabilitation," the voice on the other end said, warm but formal. He's ready to be adopted, and we're pleased to confirm that he's officially yours. A rush of relief flooded Ella's chest, as if a heavy weight had been lifted. She stood there in the quiet of her apartment, unable to speak for a moment, letting the reality sink in. Shadow, the dog she had fought so hard for, the one who had stood by her through her darkest days, was finally hers to keep forever. Tears welled up in her eyes, but this time they weren't tears of pain. They were tears of joy, of the bond she had built, the healing they had shared. "Thank you," Ella whispered, the words barely escaping her lips. But they were enough. At the shelter, the paperwork seemed endless, but Ella barely noticed. Her hand shook as she signed the final adoption papers, sealing Shadow's place in her life. She looked down at him, now resting calmly beside her, his eyes soft with trust. The shelter staff exchanged smiles as they watched the transformation unfold. Shadow's tail gave a soft thump against the floor, as if acknowledging that this wasn't just another visit. This time, it was forever. A quiet contentment settled between them, an unspoken promise that the two would never be separated again. For the first time in what felt like years, Ella sat in a circle of strangers at her therapy group. The faces around her were filled with sorrow, but none of that mattered now. Shadow sat at her feet, his body still but steady, grounding her in a way nothing else had. Ella took a deep breath, her voice shaky. "I didn't want to speak for so long, but I think it's time." She glanced at Shadow, and in his eyes she saw the courage she'd lost somewhere along the way. Her words came slowly, but they flowed with truth. The more she spoke, the more she felt the weight of her past ease, the more the silence inside her cracked open. And every time the pain became too much, Shadow nuzzled her hand, reminding her that she didn't have to face it alone. At the grief support group, Ella shared her story. It wasn't easy, but Shadow, as always, was right beside her, offering silent support. When a young woman, barely older than a teenager, began to cry uncontrollably, Ella paused. Without a moment's hesitation, Shadow rose, walked over to the girl, and laid his head gently on her lap. The girl's sobs slowed, her shaking hand reaching out to caress his fur. Without a single word, Shadow had done what Ella couldn't. He had offered comfort in its purest form. The room fell silent, and even the counselor wiped a tear from their eye. Shadow had stolen the show, but more importantly, he had stolen hearts. As the weeks passed, Shadow's healing mirrored Ella's. He no longer flinched when someone made a sudden movement, no longer shrank away from loud noises. Instead, he moved with confidence, his eyes clear, his trust in the world renewed. Ella watched him grow stronger every day, just as she did. He had taught her patience, resilience, and the power of unconditional love. And now, he was teaching himself to trust again, proving that healing wasn't just for humans. Shadow was on his own journey, one where each small victory felt as monumental as the last. Ella began volunteering at the same shelter where she had first met Shadow, the place that had become a symbol of new beginnings. Together, they worked to help other animals in need, both of them learning how to give and receive love in the process. Shadow, now more confident than ever, trained to become a certified emotional support dog. He was perfect for the role. His calm demeanor, the way he seemed to know exactly when someone needed him, made him a natural. Ella couldn't have been prouder. They were a team, each of them finding purpose in the other's presence. Together, they weren't just surviving, they were thriving. One evening, Ella sat by the window, the soft light of the setting sun casting a golden glow over the room. A letter arrived, a thank you note from a woman who had attended one of Ella's talks about grief and healing. The woman had written, "Shadow's presence saved me that day. He helped me choose to keep living." Tears welled in Ella's eyes, and she whispered, "You did that, buddy." Shadow looked up at her, his gentle eyes reflecting all the love and healing they had shared. It wasn't just a job to him, it was a mission. Ella and Shadow stood side by side at the snowy riverbank, the place where their story had begun. The wind had softened, and the once violent waters were now calm, reflecting the clear blue sky. Ella cerró los ojos, recordando el miedo, la desesperación que había sentido cuando Shadow había sido la única cosa que se interponía entre ella y su peor pesadilla. But now, as they stood together in peace, it was as if the world had come full circle. The river, the snow, the cold, all of it had lost its power over them. What once had been a place of fear was now a symbol of hope. With Shadow's head resting against her leg, Ella whispered, "We made it, buddy." And in that moment, everything felt right. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with soft hues of pink and orange, Ella knelt beside Shadow, her hand resting gently on his fur. She had never truly said the words she needed to say, but now, in the quiet calm of the riverbank, she was ready. "You didn't just save that child, Shadow," Ella whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved me, too." Shadow looked up at her, his eyes full of understanding, and in that moment she knew he knew. He had saved her, not with grand gestures, but with quiet loyalty, steady love, and a heart as big as the world itself. Together, they had healed. Together, they would always be. Ella stood there, eyes wide with disbelief as Shadow crouched by her, his fur matted and cold from the river's icy grasp. The world had seen a threat in him, the wild-eyed, misunderstood dog that had been cast aside. But Ella saw more. She saw a protector, a silent guardian waiting patiently for his chance to prove his worth. In that one moment, she realized that true heroism doesn't always wear a badge. Sometimes it's wrapped in fur, and it's those very creatures we overlook who are capable of saving us in ways we never imagined. Shadow had been overlooked time and time again, labeled unadoptable by everyone who met him. His past had marked him with fear and anger, traits that made people keep their distance. But the world didn't know Shadow like Ella did. With each passing day, he shed his old scars and began to trust again. And slowly but surely, he became the one no one knew they needed. The one whose loyalty, courage, and love would change lives. His journey from being unwanted to indispensable stood as living proof that judgment can never define the true potential of anyone, especially not a dog with a heart as vast as his. In her love for Shadow, Ella discovered something she hadn't thought possible. Healing didn't just mean fixing the parts of her heart that had been broken. It meant learning to open it again, to let others in, to share her journey of growth. Shadow had broken down the walls she'd built around herself, allowing her to connect with others in a way she hadn't been able to for years. In saving him, she had unwittingly saved herself. That leap into the frozen river, that moment of frantic courage, was more than just a rescue. It was a turning point, not just for the child, but for Shadow and Ella too. It was a leap of faith that forever altered their lives, rewriting their futures. For Ella, it meant seeing beyond fear and uncertainty, trusting the dog she had come to love. For Shadow, it was a leap from loneliness to companionship, from a troubled past to a future full of purpose. Together, they had made that leap, and it was one that would shape their destinies forever. Ella had never imagined she would find a hero in the form of a dog, but in the darkest moments it wasn't a person who came to her rescue. It was Shadow. It was his unwavering loyalty, his courage, and his unconditional love that had pulled her from the depths of despair. Ella learned the most important lesson of all. Sometimes the ones who save us are not human. They are the creatures who stand by us when no one else does. In the quiet moments as the days passed by, Ella and Shadow discovered something miraculous. They discovered that even the coldest winters, whether in the world around them or in their hearts, can eventually thaw when love is allowed to grow. Through shared pain and simple companionship, they healed one another, teaching each other that no matter how harsh the seasons of life may be, love has the power to melt even the hardest of winters. Together, they had endured the storm, and together they emerged stronger, united by a bond that nothing could break.